With ancient Egypt, we are looking at 6 strata, 6 different periods of a society that lasted 3 millennia, 3,000 years. And each one of those different periods, dynasties, we see an entire set of characters, let's call them, of kingdoms, of belief systems that for the most part were polytheistic. Polytheism meaning a belief in many gods, with the exception during the Amarna period of Akhenaten and his monotheistic beliefs that were soon thrown out the window and they returned to polytheism. So with all that said, my goal for you with ancient Egypt is to make it easy Egypt. It's not that it's that complicated, it's just that there are a lot of different components to it. I am also going to introduce some of the, let's call them lighter-hearted ones, such as a phenomenon of the more contemporary musician Sun Ra. When we think about Egypt, to an extent, we think about the fantastic, almost the surreal. We think about the 1923 discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun. This is during the last of our 6 periods, the New Kingdom. We may also think about the horror film The Mummy, made less than a decade later. King Tut was the biggest blockbuster museum exhibition. Here you see its banner at the Met advertising it to date. What is it about the glitz and the glamour of ancient Egypt that attracted such great attention? Part of it, of course, is the mythology that lies behind the various religions that occurred during each of these 6 kingdoms. The basic premise of how the royalty, the kings who ruled these kingdoms, were regarded is that they were gods in human form. There's this concept of the mythic, as in mythology, combining with the earthly. And into that you throw mummification. You have an idea of life and afterlife that's quite different from the divisions that we apply to life and death today. The lines are blurry, and the Egyptians certainly addressed this worldview that they had created with some quite original belief systems. Not to be too heavy-handed, but a good place to start trying to understand these many varieties of religious beliefs and these various kingdoms is with something as sturdy as the ground. Egypt is divided into Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. The terminology, the geographical terminology of Upper and Lower, derives from the flow of the Nile, the famous river the Nile, from the highlands of East Africa northwards towards the Mediterranean, right? So we're talking about the most northerly part of Africa. It's the opposite of a north to south flowing river like the Mississippi River in the US. And it's just it's a transposition of that more quote unquote normal north to south flowing concept, in that Upper Egypt is located to the south of Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt is upstream on the Nile. So the normal cardinal compass directions of upper, lower, north, south here are dictated and again transposed, upturned by river flow. Religion is perhaps our best lens, our best precept, operating principle through which to define and understand Egypt and the 6 major kingdoms that we'll be reviewing. Thinking about these blurred distinctions between gods and other beings, we can consider the idea, the definition, the category of a deity as one way of approaching this. A deity is what? Is a godhead who has a cult, who has followers, who is involved in sometimes, particularly in Egypt, supernatural relationship with the universe. In this way, gods can also include the king, who after his coronation rites is called a god, and deceased souls, the dead who enter the divine realm through funeral ceremonies. And this preeminence of the great gods in this polytheistic culture is rigorously maintained by rites, by ritual devotions that are performed in each of the 6 kingdoms we will regard, noting again the exception of the one division that practices monotheism. There is a lot of art produced during each of these periods in Egypt, and a lot of monuments built. The very diverse appearances of these deities, of these gods in this art, as not just humans, but animals, objects, and combination of different forms, alludes through symbolism to their essential features or characteristics. This one is known for this, that one is known for that. And in all these different eras, the various gods are regarded as holding, of course, the highest position in divine society. Divine society that bridges the earthly and the heavenly, including, let's call him the solar deity, the sun god Ra, the more mysterious god Amun, and the mother goddess Isis. The highest deity is given credit for the creation of the world, and frequently connected with this idea of the life-giving power of the sun. While some scholars think, and this is somewhat peripheral, that Egyptians eventually came to recognize a single divine power laying behind all things, and that was presented in all the deities, they still, for the most part, never abandon, outside of during the monotheistic Atonism time, this polytheistic, this plural view of the world and its gods. Many of these, let's call them narratives, storylines, are, if you think about the way the Bible sets out its own narratives, not unlike the same kinds of dramatic stories that we think about. And when we get to the Hammurabi, and we come across a set of rules that in some ways we can see relationships with the 10 Commandments. If we think about the myth starting early on with the sons of sky and earth gods, the myth of Osiris. This is a creation myth that Osiris and his brother Seth were meant to co-rule the same way that Cain and Abel were meant to in the Bible. However, Seth kills Osiris, he cuts him into lots of little pieces, and he spreads them all over Egypt. As the story goes, the goddess Isis gathers all those pieces back together and restores Osiris's body. Restoring a body is a lot of mojo. It's a big deal, right? In the myth, Osiris revives just long enough to have sex, and then he dies. But he fathers a child, Horus. So essentially, as the story goes, the son who avenges Osiris's death is Horus, who becomes the living pharaoh. The living pharaoh or king is shown in the Palette of Namrar. Here we see Isis, the sister and the wife of Osiris, and a goddess associated with magic. And here again we have Horus, son of Osiris and the god of sky kingship. And it just gets more fun from there, people. In this revival of Osiris is the idea that Ka, which is the energy of the universe, will re-enter his body. So his body is restored. And on some level, he once again becomes a living pharaoh, an alive, living mortal, but also a pharaoh who's connected to divinity. When he becomes a king, that is it concretized that he spans both the world of God and man, not unlike Jesus in the Christian Bible. God kings are often also man animals, as we see in many representations. As we move into the specific carvings, steles, and monuments, architectural structures of our first period, the early dynastic, I just want to emphasize again how dependent Egypt is on the river. Many civilizations are, of course. The whole concept of being able to easily irrigate crops and grow food, and how the division of labor flows from that without having to transport water is a big shift. It's the idea of these dualities present in death, life, flood, and drought or aridity. And that in between, some sort of a balance is achieved within not just these weather and temperature, climate ways of looking at the society, but in terms of the duality. The balancing of that duality, while engaged in an ongoing search for stability, is one of the really interesting things about Egypt and characteristic of it as a civilization. It's also a contrast with somewhere like Mesopotamia in the ancient Near East, in that Egypt, while we have different kingdoms and periods, dynasties, remained stable for centuries, whereas Mesopotamia was a situation where one civilization was replacing another. Moving into early dynastic Egypt, one of the most characteristic steles, objects, monuments representing this era is the Stele of Narmer. The Stele of Narmer is interesting from a number of perspectives. Consider it from an artistic point of view. Art can present war as glorious, as this memorable, action-charged event. It can document various battles, as we see in all civilizations and societies. It can also emphasize the horrors of war. And of course, art, as we have seen even with something like the Rosie the Riveter World War II poster, can serve as propaganda. Or another poster from that same World War II era, Uncle Sam Wants You. Beginning our focus in Egypt with the palette of Narmer is a way of focusing on how art can be used as war propaganda. What do we see here? Two sides, the back and front of the stele. Let's look quickly first at the back on the right side. In the middle of this depression, in the lower center, is a kind of palette, a mixing bowl for the black eye makeup, the kohl that we see in all our movies about Egypt and images of Egyptians. This is from about 3000 BCE, worn by Egyptian men and women. It's what we see football players wear in order to reflect the glare. And of course, in the Egyptian climate, that makes sense. Narmer king of Upper Egypt, is already victorious in the war against Lower Egypt. If we think about the way that language at this time, the cuneiforms, the earliest signs of written language that we get from the Sumerians, written symbols that often consist of phonetic sounds. This is how the earliest, again, written language was first created. At the top of the front of the stele to the left, and we'll take a closer look at that, we can see pictures of a carp and a chisel, vertical and horizontal. Together, these pictures of these two images create the name Narmer. What else do we see in these images? Is this propaganda for Narmer as a warrior, as a king, as a conqueror? He's, as we see on the left, bigger, taller, one of the largest hieratic scale representations that we see after the ancient Near East. Barefoot, with his attendant holding his shoes as he kills Nubians. And there are dead Nubians on the bottom of the register. Remember, registers are these bands or horizontal panels. It's significant that he's not showing that he has shoes that his attendant is holding for him, but he's not wearing them. This idea of being barefoot reinforces his sacred nature. Narmer is holding the hair on the head of a Nubian he's about to kill. And if we look to the upper right, just above him, we see Horus in his bird, eagle form with a human arm, basically instructing, mandating Narmer as to what to do. Horus here is also representing the god of Upper Egypt, and Narmer, king of Upper Egypt, is, through this battle against the Nubians, victorious in a war against Lower Egypt. So there is also, in a very bloodthirsty way, this idea of unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Horus is also standing, if we look closely, on papyrus. Papyrus is the traditional representation of Lower Egypt. Another aspect to Narmer shown here is barefoot, is a way of sanctifying killing as a sacred act, because he is here borrowing from a sacred status of a godhead. So it's justification in a sense, and that certainly can be qualified as propaganda for the act of killing his enemy in his conquering of Lower Egypt. Again, looking at this square with its vertical and horizontal representation of Narmer's name in the shape of the chisel and the carp, we again have this idea of how pictographs are the representations of the earliest language. The Rosetta Stone isn't on our lecture guide, and hence we'll just do a quick pass on it, only because it is such an important and representative stele of his time, and also a phrase in the vernacular of all, certainly Western and many Eastern languages as well. The Rosetta Stone was the first ancient Egyptian multi-language text, bilingual text, recovered in modern times in 1799. And it was something that aroused great widespread worldwide curiosity. partially because here we have a stele with 3 clear registers, horizontal bands, that was written in 3 scripts. The reason being that in Egypt at that time, 3 scripts were used. The first was hieroglyphic, the script used for important or religious documents. The second was called Demotic, which was the common script, common language at that time. The third was in Greek, which was the language of the rulers. So because it was written in all 3 scripts, priests, government officials, and rulers of Egypt could all read it. Moving into the reconstruction drawings here and photographs of Joseph's funerary complex, most important thing to say about these buildings is how they functioned and that they also fulfilled a rather bizarre post-life idea. These are called mastaba in terms of a style. Very early on, tombs were single story and had flat roofs and were called mastaba. Joseph's architect conceived of an improvement on a stepped pyramid with different levels. And as you can see, these are rather, compared especially to the Great Pyramids in Giza and other places with which we're more familiar. These are a different kind of construction. They're rather rough and crumbly looking. And this one that we are looking at is the centerpiece of what you can see as a built complex. An interesting thing about that is that Joseph's body was not in the pyramid. Early on, they didn't have this idea of pharaohs in their pyramid tombs, but being buried underneath them. This is constructed of stone, not baked clay. And you can also see some similarities if we think back to the ziggurats from the ANE period. The story of Joseph is one that is kind of a bizarre, much earlier version of something like The Greatest Race. This complex, what was built around the mastaba, the tomb, was a recreation of a race route for Joseph's soul to run after his death. So it's kind of like a movie set. These kind of like almost like a fake construct, a scene set of rubbles with this finished front in front of it. You have to think that people believed this. 10,000 people built this pyramid for one dead body. So they were quite invested in this idea of this race that Joseph ran for his soul. When we study these structures, an important thing to remember is the sheer laboriousness of building these. And no, it seems that slaves did not build them. You can only really do this in society when things are stable, when you're not fighting wars, when you have reliable food sources as opposed to shortages. The Old Kingdom that we will move into now is a period marked by a tremendous political stability for quite a long period of time. Here we see some of the classic Great Pyramids of Giza. These will eventually be phased out by the time of the Middle Kingdom, which follows the Old Kingdom. Major reason being that they experienced a lot of tomb looting, and what follows architecturally are rock-cut tombs into cliffs. Still in the Old Kingdom, we're looking here at Khafre, bare-chested, wearing something that looks like a kilt. He's got a crown and a beard, all the trappings of a king, and also meant to look in command and timeless. And back of him is perched Horus in his divine bird man form. There's this idea of the living King Horus who can also simultaneously inhabit and be represented by this bird man form. Again, this idea of uniting binary opposites that can seem confusing, but in the Egyptian cosmology makes sense. In this detail, we see the papyrus, which is representative of the Lower Nile. And these two elements here are shown united, representing the idea of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Here to the right of Khafre, we see Menkore. Menkore is Khafre's son, and here he stands in, again, this very representative Egyptian statue pose. Note the gestural step forward and the arms straight at the side. A very classic representation. The only difference here is the way we see his queen's left arm reach out towards her mate. And it lends to this very regal pair of statuary. A personal and an intimate note. Looking here at the scribe, we see something that is quite a contrast. The scribe is rather refreshing. It's kind of an ordinary Joe, slightly chubby around his midsection. And this is a demonstration of a member of the kingdom and someone peripheral to the royal family who is not one of them, is not a pharaoh, is not a god. He has a humble job that is nonetheless an important one. He's a scribe. He is a recorder on, as you can see here, on a piece of papyrus. He's preserving, in a sense, the lives. He's a biographer of these people. So we get to see an image of someone and his work materials that are unrelated to the kingly. As mentioned, in the Middle Kingdom, which we're pretty much going to skip through, we see the introduction of these rock-cut tombs, the next iteration, the next version of pyramids. And again, these were primarily, the impetus for making these was primarily one to avoid looting. The time of the reign of Hatshepsut is an era of one of Egypt's not only most remarkable female pharaohs, but pharaohs. Hatshepsut was very successful in her reign. She ran victorious military campaigns. She was certainly someone who did as much, if not more so, than many male pharaohs. However, not uncommonly, we see her sometimes adopting her physical appearance by sometimes wearing a beard, sometimes she's bare-chested, sometimes not, sometimes she's wearing male attire. One of the most important achievements of Hatshepsut was her temple complex. Quite elegantly and beautifully, an architectural feat. Ramps and platforms were introduced on two different levels that lead into the cliffside, again, representative of these newer cliffside tombs. And with this next step, we can see how much architecture in Egypt controls our experience of it. It was a navigational challenge, in a sense, to figure out how to encounter, to engage with a structure, going up a ramp, crossing a courtyard, encountering another ramp. There's also the concept that a hierarchical idea, one of levels, is introduced in a more intimate, humanly accessible way. On the ground floor, there might be a certain kind of a party that was status and class rank. So some priests and priestesses would be there. Some wouldn't. A couple of goddesses might be thrown into the act, or they might be in an upper platform. So it's a really interesting approach to, again, hierarchical, architectural, social scaling.